Okay, my goal is to be the first person up here where the bell doesn't bing out of everybody who's gone so far. I began covering technology for the Irish Times over 2 decades ago now, which is so long ago in technology terms that in my first published article in the Irish Times, which was on resources for women on the internet, I had to explain exactly what the World Wide Web actually was. Because at the time, the internet had only just begun to transition over from a command line interface, which was words and numbers and a little blinking cursor, to the graphical interface, the web, that we now use every day and most people think is the internet. And that was in the mid-1990s. But only a few years later, the strange new online world was growing so fast and becoming so important to communications and business tool that the Irish need for fresh telecoms infrastructure, meaning fast, high bandwidth fiber optic cables to replace the old, slow copper wire network, was increasingly apparent. And if that sounds familiar, that's because we're still talking about it. In Ireland, we'd seen a gradual influx of large technology companies, as well as financial service companies in the IFSC and in other locations, and it was becoming clear that to hang on to those and to attract more, we'd need good broadband. The internet was also of growing importance to Irish citizens and society, for schools, for research, for communication, opening up new rural opportunities and jobs. Of course, it's a big argument for areas outside of Dublin as part of the National Broadband Plan. To access the arts, entertainment, to shop, to easily interact with state institutions and local and national authorities. And yet the planned communication infrastructure programs were going nowhere. And I wrote this for a column in 1998. As a narrowly focused debate continues over the Republic's broadband capabilities, the telecommunications network's ability to handle the growing range of bandwidth-demanding data applications over the internet, the relevant issues vital to a healthy, competitive business climate still have not been addressed. And you'd be forgiven for thinking that was one I wrote last week rather than one I prepared 21 years earlier. Because 2 decades on, we still face many of the same unresolved or barely progressed issues as we did in 1998, the year the Belfast Agreement was signed, the planning tribunal opened in Dublin Castle, and Bill Clinton visited Ireland for the second time. Broadband is still making headlines, and for all the wrong reasons. We have a national broadband plan that raises more questions than it answers in the midst of massive cost overruns, with a provider chosen from a shortlisted field of exactly one after all the other competitors bailed out. So how did we come to be here? Well, to be honest, for me it's a bit of a surprise in a way, because although this particular panel is about how we always seem to screw up these major infrastructure plans, resulting in these kinds of delays and cost overruns, botched developments and reverse directions, we've actually had 2 golden moments in telecoms build-out, although I'm now afraid of even putting forth this argument with these 2 other panelists on this panel. But in my opinion, I think we've had 2 very good telecoms build-out projects that show the state can do these things well. The first was Ireland's shift in the early 1980s from the old fuzzy analog phone systems that were common across the world at the time to sharp and clear digital networks. And I'm sure probably all of you of a certain age will remember that point. And I arrived in Ireland in 1984 and stayed on to study at UCD and then at Trinity. So I always say I can sit on both sides of the fence in that rivalry. And when I would, in those rare times I would call home, because it was very expensive to call home on the old AB phones in the hallway of your bedsit building, my mother in California, near Silicon Valley, always marveled at the crystal clear line, and she'd say they were much better. My calls to her and the lines that we had were much better than the calls that she made to my brother just across town, and she'd wonder how that could be. Well, it could be because the Irish state decided very presciently to migrate the Irish network to this new standard, thus leapfrogging not just other EU states, but much of the world, including much of the US. Here, we were small. We could make this transition at lower cost, and I do say we now because I became an Irish citizen last September, so I can say we after all my years here. But we were small. We could make this transition at lower cost and faster than large states. And for years, it gave Ireland a competitive advantage that paid off handsomely in jobs and investment. If you ever wondered why Ireland suddenly became a call center world capital in the 80s and 90s, this is why. And some of those early call centers were soon upgraded to much broader and deeper operations by the companies involved, including many tech companies that initially came here to focus on phone sales and support, but ended up with manufacturing, then research and development, then their European headquarters here. And much of this all building on top of what was then simply a national network upgrade. The second, albeit brief, moment came as the 90s rolled over into the noughties with broadband infrastructure, when what we did right was instigated by Mary O'Rourke as Minister for the Department of Public Enterprise, who understood she had a particularly gifted department secretary in Brendan Chewy, who was a former engineer. He fully got telecoms and the potential of the internet, as did his small team of civil servants, all who had quite impressive or built up a very impressive telecoms understanding, and I was delighted. I thought I recognized Eddie Malloy's name, and it's because he was part of that group doing some of that work at the time. What they tried to do then, I think, was nothing short of visionary at an international scale, and I believe will be over time understood as their historical legacy crucial to Ireland's continuing general economic health. And I think our fast recovery after the last downturn was thanks in part to the presence of so many job-creating multinationals, particularly in the tech sector, and that's despite the problems and concerns they also generate, of which there are many. Much of what happened in the 90s occurred because O'Rourke, instead of going to the usual consultancies for a report, established a most extraordinary advisory committee on telecommunications, ACT for short, which included people like Vint Cerf, who now is a common name if you're interested in the internet at all. You've probably read about him as the father of the internet, and he's seen as a global icon in technology. ACT, there were other members as well. They were all international figures in telecoms and technology at the time, hit the ground running, met intensively just 3 times to get input from industry, business, and community representatives here. And then they published a small, smart, concise report. They did all of that within 5 months in 1998. They also did it for free. Despite frustrating indifference, O'Rourke managed to squeeze through several of its recommendations, and this is where I came in. This is when I was really so intrigued at what was happening in Ireland, and I grew up in Silicon Valley, so I have some context for understanding this shift. This is really when I decided technology was what I was really interested in writing about. A lot of other people saw tech coverage as what you did until you jumped into the real jobs like political correspondents or economic editors, but I loved covering tech because I thought what's happening in Ireland is just amazing. What they managed to squeeze through was several of the ACT's recommendations, which included a crucial groundbreaking public-private investment with telecommunications company Global Crossing to bring a fiber optic cable across from the U.S. To Ireland, which placed us directly on what they call the internet backbone, whereas before we were just a spur off the London exchanges and we were subject to the pricing and capacity whims of British telecom companies. So suddenly we had the unlimited capacity or the large capacity of this cable which had some limits but was massive for the time. And it came directly to us. The government bought half of that cable's capacity and then sold it at a steep discount to encourage the growth of e-business, something which was then criticized by many in the media as the government is losing money. It paid all this money for telecoms infrastructure, and now it's selling it cheaper than what it cost, not understanding, I think, that telecoms costs tend to drop like this in the same way that computer prices tend to drop over time. And also the goal was not for the state to make money on this. The goal was to spur the start of this whole new industry and these benefits for citizens as well. And I can't emphasize enough that what they were doing was seen as a global model. It's why the ACT people decided to do the work for free, because if you go to a bunch of people, many of whom are multimillionaires, who are extremely successful in their jobs and extremely busy, and you say, we have a small country, what would you do with it if you could start from a blank slate and come up with an idea to make us a global power in this area? And they were enthralled to be asked to do this. They just found it fascinating, I knew from talking to some of them. And the shift in what happened here then in terms of capacity, we got a second cable that came in after that from another provider. It put Ireland, as one insider in the US told me who helps negotiate business deals here, he said Ireland went from being this tiny country that if it was seen at all was just seen as, well, maybe you'd work onto a short list of 10 or 15 places to go. He said by the early 2000s, Ireland was already automatically on every company's short list that they were looking at setting up in Europe. And that made the IDA's work a lot easier, of course. If Global Crossing hadn't gone through, I'm in no doubt that we'd be an utterly different Ireland with greater economic uncertainty, because almost immediately after that cable came in and the second one was coming towards completion, we had the dot-com crash, and then we had the 2008 crash. But even that dot-com crash that happened in the early 2000s meant the collapse of all these telecom companies, amongst them Global Crossing. And we would not have had the independence from those perhaps Brexiting London exchanges, and we'd have struggled with weak and uncertain international internet connectivity, and certainly been of declining interest to the international business sector, especially the tech sector. Yet much of the ACT report continued to be ignored by government as a whole and was never implemented. So in 2000, Mary O'Rourke reconvened that committee with mostly the same membership. It reported in 2002, and it proposed that by 2005, Ireland, and this is a quote, will have switched to a low-cost, open-access, always-on and national broadband information infrastructure available to all citizens. Some key elements of that report were achieved, such as increased connectivity for researchers, universities and schools, and backing for regional broadband developments, the MANs as they're called. But proposals for broader public-private partnerships and the provision of a special revolving state-backed investment fund and tax incentives for joined-up broadband development across the country were never fully supported. So close to 2 decades later, with the current national broadband plan, we are facing a mess that never had to be. Thanks to the Global Crossing deal, we have the international connectivity. But we're left with so many what-ifs and a saga of heart-sinking failure, so heart-sinking that I stopped covering this area of broadband and telecoms because it just was so exasperating to me that this had happened. Now we've had successive ministers that have tried and failed to get a comprehensive national broadband network in place. And I think those attempts form a checklist of reasons why I think the state struggles with big infrastructure projects. And so I'll just run through my reasons. First, I think the state is, of course, very small, as a small open economy, as Colin said. And funding is always going to be an issue, especially with a national politics that is essentially local. So there's very tight competition for funding and varying views on how such projects should be developed, and those create tensions between departments and civil servants who are often reliant on these reports from consultancy firms that may be advising on or benefiting from other aspects of the same project. Ireland also has a very odd telecoms regulatory framework in which Comreg oversees some parts and government departments who don't seem to trust Comreg oversee others, and the government is proposing to be the regulator for the National Broadband Plan, which leaves the government regulating some of its own projects, such as the state's the municipal networks. In addition, in a problem that plagues large countries too, people move between jobs at the regulator or in government to jobs in the companies they were regulating, retaining relationships and connections that may rightly or wrongly make government or regulators feel the other party is too close to those being regulated. This also can create situations in which the various parties have preferred outcomes during what should be a neutral scoping or bidding process. And of course, then you have the consultancies tying into all of that, all of which must prompt a governance question on whether there is regulatory capture, a situation in which the regulated have close relationships with those who have oversight. This might be seen as a small country problem, but if you look across the water over to the U.S. and what Trump has done with the Environmental Protection Agency, the Federal Trade Commission, or the Federal, Communications Committee, where there's barely any effort to even hide such capture, it indicates it's a universal challenge. Additional issues in big telecoms and other projects arise because they're big and complex by definition, involving multiple contractors and large amounts of money dispersed at many levels. This makes for many potential zones of exploitation as different parties seek to create a playing field that benefits them best strategically and financially over the longest run possible. And often they will set up these, that if they're big companies, they have the wherewithal to set up these quite complex structures of shell companies, which moves money around. And so we're never quite sure what's actually managing where money is going within these big companies. And of course, finally, telecoms projects are highly technical. So journalists, politicians, and the general public struggle to understand what's actually happening and what is being promised behind the barrage of acronyms, sector terminology, and the technicality of how things work. And I think we saw a good example of that in the recent National Broadband Plan hearing, when you could see TDs kind of glazing over at all of that terminology being put forward. So how do we fix the NBP? That's a session on its own, but I think the wrong direction is just to assume, as some in government are now arguing and elsewhere, that we should just plow ahead with what we've been left with, because otherwise the project will be further delayed. And I would argue that we need to get the National Broadband Plan right, not get it fast, especially as fast is already highly relative when we've been waiting for something better since the late 1990s. Thank you.
Thanks very much.